I grew up in a two-story brick colonial house on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. To strangers, it was the kind of house that drew admiration. White shutters framed the windows, a wide porch wrapped around the front, and oak trees stretched their limbs across the yard like protective arms. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with houses that looked like postcards, with freshly cut grass and American flags waving on front lawns. From the outside, everything about our house said stability, tradition, and pride. But on the inside, the walls carried something heavier than cedar wood and old wallpaper. They carried the weight of favoritism. My brother Michael was 3 years younger than I, and from the very beginning, it was clear he was the favorite. My parents, David and Patricia, never said it out loud, but their actions screamed it every single day. I can still remember Michael's 16th birthday as if it had happened yesterday. I was standing by the front steps, wearing a faded denim jacket I had bought at a thrift store with babysitting money, when my parents let him out the front door with their hands covering his eyes. The driveway was lit with string lights, neighbors gathered around, and there in the center was a black Ford Mustang, shining under the glow of those bulbs like a jewel. When they pulled their hands away, Michael gasped, and the crowd clapped like they had just witnessed history. My father tossed him the keys that probably cost $30,000, and Michael grinned so wide it was like the whole world had bent to his happiness. My mother cried happy tears, hugging him like he had just won the Nobel Prize. Stood there, clapping with the rest, my stomach tight, remembering my own 16th birthday. The gift I had received was a paperback journal, bought from the local bookstore, with my name scribbled on the first page in my mother's handwriting. Don't get me wrong, I loved writing, and part of me appreciated the gesture. But the disparity between a $30,000 car and a $6 notebook was not something a teenage girl could ignore. It wasn't just about money. It was about what that difference meant. To them, Michael deserved grandeur, while I was given reminders to stay quiet, to record my feelings rather than express them. That was just one example. Every holiday carried its own version of the same story. When Michael turned 18, he was sent on a 2-week trip to Europe with friends, Paris, London, and Rome. I had begged for a similar trip at his age, dreaming of walking through the streets of Florence, sketchbook in hand, but instead I was given a sweater, 2 sizes too big, with the tag still attached. They told me it was practical. Michael returned from his trip with stories of sipping espresso in Italian cafes and photos of him in front of Big Ben, while I listened, nodding, pretending the ache inside me wasn't growing heavier. It wasn't that I was lazy or unmotivated. Quite the opposite. I pushed myself harder, determined to prove my worth through achievement. I graduated high school with honors, earned a scholarship to Boston University, and studied late into the nights when my friends were out partying. By 25, I was working as a financial analyst in New York City, sitting in glass-walled offices overlooking Manhattan, the numbers on my computer screen proving I was good at something real. But no matter what I achieved, at home, I was invisible. I tried to bridge the gap with thoughtful gifts, thinking maybe if I gave enough, I'd finally be seen. On my mother's birthday, I bought her a cashmere scarf from Bloomingdale's, pale blue because it matched her eyes. On Father's Day, I saved up for a set of golf clubs he had mentioned months earlier. I wrapped them carefully, imagining the moment of surprise, the gratitude. But when the day came, their smiles seemed rehearsed, polite. Then Michael would walk in with something ordinary, a bouquet picked up on the way home, a bottle of wine from the grocery store, and suddenly the room would burst with delight. "Michael, you always know just what we need," my mother would say, beaming at him, as if he had discovered the cure for loneliness. My gifts were placed aside, sometimes forgotten, while his offerings took center stage. It didn't matter that I had spent weeks planning and saving. Their pride belonged to him. The house itself became a stage for this imbalance. In the living room, above the fireplace, hung a collection of family photos. Michael's sports trophies gleamed from the mantel, and framed pictures of him at school events lined the shelves. There was one picture of me at my high school graduation, tucked in the corner, partially hidden behind a vase. When guests came over, my mother would lead them through the house, pointing out Michael's achievements, showing them his college acceptance letter framed on the wall. My accomplishments were rarely mentioned. The holidays were the hardest. Christmas morning was a spectacle of Michael's gifts, each one larger and more expensive than the last. I can still picture the year he unwrapped a brand new laptop while I tore open a box to find a pair of wool socks. My father chuckled, saying, "Well, at least your feet will be warm." I laughed along because what else could I do? But when Michael plugged in his laptop and the family gathered around to admire it, I felt myself shrinking into the couch cushions, the socks limp in my lap. It wasn't just the material things. It was the way my parents looked at him, their eyes glowing with pride, as if he carried all their hopes for the future. With me, their tone was always tempered, their praise faint. "That's nice," they'd say when I told them about a promotion. "Well done." When I mentioned my savings account was growing, nothing I did ever seemed enough to spark the fire in their eyes that Michael so effortlessly lit. Sometimes I wondered if I was imagining it. Maybe I was too sensitive, too desperate for validation. But the evidence piled up, year after year, and denial could no longer cushion the truth. They had chosen their favorite, and it wasn't me. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I stopped expecting the balance to change. I built my independence out of necessity, carving a life in New York that looked strong from the outside. I worked long hours, paid my bills on time, and decorated my tiny apartment with secondhand furniture that I sanded and painted myself. On weekends, I took walks through Central Park, journaling about my life, the same way I had when I was 16 with that cheap notebook. Only now the words were sharper, the sentences heavier with meaning, yet every trip home was a reminder. Walking into that Charleston house meant stepping back into the role I had always played, the overlooked daughter, the one who didn't matter as much. I carried my achievements like armor, but in their presence it felt flimsy. No matter how much I built outside those walls, inside them I was still the girl with the journal, standing in the shadow of the boy with the Mustang. That imbalance shaped me in ways both painful and powerful. It taught me resilience, yes, but it also carved a hollow space in me, one that longed for something so simple and so rare in my family, to be chosen, to be celebrated, to be enough. And as much as I told myself I had accepted it, deep down I knew the story wasn't over. The house of unequal gifts had set the stage for what was to come. Christmas Eve should feel magical. It should smell like pine needles and cinnamon, sound like carols playing faintly in the background, and feel like the warmth of family gathered together. But for me, that night in Atlanta, Georgia, it felt like the unraveling of years I had tried to piece together with hope, effort, and denial. I had flown down from New York with a gift I thought would finally bridge the invisible gap between my father and me. For months, I had saved, skipping dinners out, ignoring the itch of holiday sales, setting aside every spare dollar from my paycheck. I had spotted a vintage Rolex at a small shop tucked on the corner of Fifth Avenue. It was from the late 70s, with a gold bezel and a dark leather strap. Elegant, but understated. The price tag had made me hesitate. $8,000. That was no small amount, not for me. But I told myself it was worth it. My father loved watches. He talked about them the way other men talked about sports, with a gleam in his eyes and a knowledge that came from obsession. If anything could show him I was paying attention, if anything could make him proud, it was this. I wrapped the velvet box carefully, choosing paper patterned with gold stars and tying it with a red ribbon. I imagined the moment he would open it. I could see his face lighting up, his voice rising with surprise, his arms pulling me into a hug. Maybe, just maybe, that moment would undo years of being overshadowed. When I walked into my parents' house in Atlanta that evening, the living room was already alive with laughter and the glow of the Christmas tree. The tree sparkled with ornaments, collected over decades, from glass baubles passed down from my grandmother to lopsided ones Michael and I had made in grade school. Michael was, as always, the center of attention. He stood in front of the fireplace in a tailored navy suit, his fiancée Lauren clinging to his arm like an accessory. My mother fussed over them, straightening his tie, adjusting her pearls, and beaming at her son like he was the very embodiment of perfection. I set my coat on the back of a chair and clutched the gift in my hands, waiting for the right moment. When my father finally settled into his recliner, I stepped forward and placed the box in his lap. My hands trembled slightly as I said, "Merry Christmas, Dad. I thought you'd like this." He untied the ribbon with little fanfare, tore the paper, and opened the box. For a heartbeat, I held my breath. His eyes scanned the watch, his mouth pulled into a thin line, and he muttered, "Oh, that's nice." Then he set it aside on the coffee table, already reaching for the glass of bourbon at his side. The silence that followed in my chest was deafening. I had imagined gasps, gratitude, perhaps even tears. Instead, my father's tone was no different than if I had handed him a new pair of socks. Before I could process the disappointment, my mother clapped her hands and announced, "Now, for the real surprise." She motioned for everyone to gather near the window. My father grinned as he led Michael outside. Confused, I followed, the cold December air biting my skin. There, sitting in the driveway under a massive red bow, was a brand new Mercedes sedan. Its silver body gleamed under the porch lights, every inch of it screaming wealth and indulgence. The crowd erupted with applause and cheers. My father tossed Michael the keys, his voice booming with pride. "You deserve it, son. You've worked so hard." My mother kissed Michael's cheek, tears slipping down her face as if this moment was the pinnacle of her life. Lauren squealed and clung to Michael's arm, already gushing about road trips they'd take. I stood frozen, my arms wrapped tightly around myself. My $8,000 sacrifice sat forgotten on the coffee table, while $70,000 of parental devotion sat on four wheels in the driveway. The contrast hit me like a punch to the gut. Inside, the party swelled with joy. Neighbors toasted to Michael's success, relatives took turns sitting in the Mercedes, and laughter filled every corner of the house. I tried to smile, tried to blend into the background, but inside I was collapsing. My gift, the one I had poured my effort and savings into, had already been buried under the noise of celebration. I excused myself quietly, slipping into the hallway that led to my childhood bedroom. The room hadn't changed much. Posters from my teenage years still clung to the walls. My old bookshelf still held paperbacks with dog-eared pages. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at my hands, the same hands that had wrapped that gift, with hope. My chest ached with a mixture of rage and sorrow. I wanted to scream, to demand why I wasn't enough, why my father couldn't see me the way he saw Michael. But I knew the answer. It had always been the same. As the night wound down and the house fell into silence, I made my decision. It wasn't planned, but it felt inevitable. At 2 a.m, I zipped my suitcase shut, careful not to wake anyone. I carried it downstairs, my footsteps soft against the creaking wooden floor. The Rolex still sat on the coffee table where my father had left it untouched. I looked at it one last time, the ribbon lying limp beside it, and turned away. Outside, the winter air was sharp and unforgiving. My breath fogged in front of me as I loaded the suitcase into the trunk of my car. I glanced up at the house, the windows dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree. For years, that house had held me captive in its cycle of favoritism and neglect. Leaving it in the middle of the night felt like breaking free of chains I hadn't realized were wrapped so tightly around me. The highway stretched ahead, long and empty, the yellow lines flickering beneath my headlights like an invitation. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I didn't know where I was going, not exactly, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I drove, memories flickered in my mind. Birthdays where Michael was showered with gifts while I was handed envelopes with $20 bills. Holidays where my achievements were barely acknowledged. Dinners where conversations revolved around him while I sat quietly, fading into the background. Each memory piled onto the next until the weight of them became unbearable. But with every mile I put between myself and that Atlanta house, I felt a strange lightness. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't measuring myself against Michael. I was choosing myself, even if it meant driving into the unknown. I drove until dawn, until the sky turned pale pink and the horizon stretched wide. I stopped at a gas station in rural Georgia, my body stiff, my eyes tired. As I filled the tank, I caught my reflection in the car window. I looked exhausted, yes, but I also looked free. That night had changed everything. It wasn't just about the Rolex or the Mercedes. It was about years of being unseen, of pouring myself into a family that refused to hold me in the same light they held Michael. Walking out of that house wasn't just leaving, it was reclaiming myself. And though I didn't know it then, that drive into the night would be the start of a new chapter in my life. One built not on being chosen by others, but on finally choosing myself. When I pulled into Asheville that morning, the sun was rising over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and lavender. I had been driving all night, running on fumes of adrenaline and heartbreak. My car was heavy with exhaustion, and so was I. I didn't know exactly where else to go, but I knew who I could call. Claire. Claire had been my closest friend since college. We met in a philosophy class at Boston University, sitting side by side with our notebooks open and our heads bent over the professor's endless ramblings. Where I was reserved and cautious, Claire was bold and free-spirited. She had a way of seeing through people, of pulling out the truth whether you wanted it revealed or not. Over the years, she became the one person I could trust completely. When I pulled up in front of her townhouse, I barely made it out of the car before she was at the door in her robe, arms crossed, her face a mixture of worry and exasperation. "You look like hell," she said, though her voice was warm. I laughed weakly, and then, without another word, she wrapped me in her arms. The embrace undid me. Tears spilled down my cheeks, soaking into her shoulder, and for the first time in years I didn't bother to hide them. She held me until the sobs quieted, then pulled me inside. Her townhouse was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of lavender candles. She settled me on the couch, draped a blanket over my shoulders, and pressed a steaming mug of chamomile tea into my hands. Then she sat across from me, legs tucked under her, and waited. The story tumbled out of me in fragments. The forgotten Rolex, the Mercedes with its gleaming bow, the years of unequal gifts that had led to that breaking point. My words came out jagged, but Claire didn't interrupt. She didn't try to fix it or tell me I was overreacting. She simply listened, her green eyes steady, her silence like a bomb. When I finished, she reached across the coffee table and took my hand. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Leaving was the bravest thing you could have done." Her words cracked something open inside me. For so long, I had doubted myself, convinced I was too sensitive, too needy, too desperate for validation. But hearing Claire call my decision brave shifted the weight, even if just slightly. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and slow healing. I stayed with Claire at first, curling up on her couch under the same blanket she'd given me that first night. She insisted I stay as long as I needed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being a burden. I threw myself into work instead, logging 12-hour days on my laptop, crunching numbers for clients while ignoring the chaos inside me. It was Claire who nudged me toward therapy. One evening, she slid a business card across the coffee table. "Her name's Dr. Howard," she said. "She's good, and you can't carry this all on your own anymore." The first session was awkward. I sat in a leather chair in a warmly lit office, staring at a bookshelf lined with titles about trauma, healing, and family dynamics. Dr. Howard was kind but direct, guiding me gently into places I had spent years avoiding. I talked about the Mustang, the trips to Europe, the forgotten scarf and golf clubs, the socks that became the punchline of Christmas morning. I cried, I laughed bitterly, and sometimes I sat in silence, words caught in my throat. Week after week, she helped me untangle the threads of my past, showing me how deeply favoritism had carved itself into my identity. In between therapy and work, I began searching for my own place. I couldn't stay on Claire's couch forever, though she would have let me. After weeks of scrolling through listings, I found it. A small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Asheville, painted white with green shutters and a little porch swing. The price was $220,000, terrifying but possible. Signing the papers felt surreal. For the first time in my life, I was buying something for me, not for anyone else's approval. The house wasn't perfect. The floors creaked, the paint was peeling in places, and the kitchen needed updating. But when I walked through the empty rooms, sunlight spilling through the windows, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. I spent weekends painting the walls a soft blue, my favorite color. I bought furniture piece by piece, a second-hand couch from a thrift store, a wooden dining table I found online, a bed with a frame I assembled myself, cursing under my breath at the directions. Each object was chosen by me, for me. For once, I wasn't thinking about what would impress anyone else. Slowly, the house began to feel like a home. I filled it with books, framed photos of moments that mattered, and plants that sat in sunlit corners. Every decision was mine, and with each brushstroke of paint, each nail hammered into the wall, I reclaimed a little more of myself. Claire was there through it all, hauling boxes, painting trim, and making jokes when I got frustrated. And through her, I met new people. Neighbors who dropped off cookies, friends from her book club who invited me to join, colleagues who surprised me with their kindness. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who cared not about what I could provide, but simply about who I was. It was a strange revelation, learning that family could be chosen. That love could come from people who weren't bound by blood but by respect and care. These friendships became my lifeline. We shared meals around my new dining table, laughter echoing through the house that had once been so quiet. At night, I sometimes sat on the porch swing with a glass of wine, staring at the stars above the mountains. I thought about the house. In Charleston, the Christmas in Atlanta, the Rolex left forgotten. And though the ache was still there, it was no longer the center of my world. I was building something new, something stronger. Therapy taught me to set boundaries, to recognize the patterns of neglect I had endured, and to understand that I wasn't broken. I had simply been shaped by people who couldn't see me for who I was. Slowly, I learned to let go of the need for their approval. I began journaling again, not in the notebook from my 16th birthday, but in one I bought for myself, leather-bound and heavy in my hands. I wrote about the pain, yes, but also about the small victories, the first night in my new house, the laughter of friends in my kitchen, the peace of mornings spent drinking coffee on the porch. It wasn't an instant transformation. Healing never is. There were still nights when loneliness crept in, when memories of favoritism gnawed at me, when I questioned my worth. But I no longer faced those nights alone. I had Claire, I had therapy, I had a home that was mine. Piece by piece, I was rebuilding. And though I didn't know it then, the foundation I was laying in Asheville would be what carried me through the next storm. The invitation arrived in a thick ivory envelope, the kind embossed with gold lettering meant to scream elegance and importance. Michael and Lauren's names gleamed across the page, announcing their wedding at the Jefferson Hotel in Charleston. My first instinct was to toss it into the trash, to let it sink among bills and catalogs. But I didn't. Instead, I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for days, the words pulling at me like a challenge I couldn't ignore. Part of me wanted to skip the event altogether. After everything, after years of favoritism, the breaking point on that Christmas Eve, the long nights rebuilding myself in Asheville, I had every reason to stay away. But another part of me knew I needed to go, not for them, but for me. This wasn't about seeking their approval anymore. This was about facing the truth head-on, not hiding from it. I began preparing weeks before the wedding. Not just my outfit or the logistics of the trip, but something deeper. Therapy had taught me the power of evidence, of grounding my emotions. In fact, so I wouldn't be dismissed as too sensitive, I dug through years of receipts, photos, and bank statements. There were the car payments for Michael's Mustang, the invoices from his European vacations, and the registration fees for his endless extracurriculars. Side by side, I placed my own records. The $20 checks for birthdays, the practical sweaters, the gift receipts for the thoughtful presents I had bought my parents, most of which were never acknowledged. When I finished, I had a file thick enough to weigh down my bag. I wasn't planning to cause a scene just for spectacle. I was planning to tell the truth once and for all. On the day of the wedding, I slipped into a deep green gown I had chosen carefully. It was simple, elegant, and it made me feel powerful. I wasn't there to fade into the background anymore. Claire was by my side as always. She wore a navy dress and a knowing expression, reminding me with every glance that I wasn't alone. The Jefferson Hotel glittered with chandeliers and gold accents, a stage perfectly set for Michael and Lauren's grand performance. The air buzzed with champagne bubbles and polished laughter. Guests mingled in sequined gowns and sharp tuxedos, their voices filled with admiration for the couple. My parents floated through the crowd, faces glowing with pride, as if they were royalty presenting their heir. When Michael and Lauren exchanged vows, the room sighed with adoration. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and my parents clasped each other's hands like their life's work had been fulfilled. I clapped along with everyone else, my heart steady. I wasn't here to ruin their day. I was here to reclaim mine. The toasts began after dinner. Friends told funny stories about Michael. Colleagues praised his charm and ambition, and my father gave a speech that felt rehearsed, each word dripping with pride. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, and then it was my turn. I hadn't been asked to speak, of course, but I rose from my chair anyway. The clinking of silverware faded as people turned their eyes toward me. My pulse raced, but my voice, when it came, was steady. "I'd like to say something," I began. A hush fell over the room. My parents' smiles faltered. Michael shifted uneasily in his chair. I drew in a breath and let the words pour out. "For years, I've watched patterns repeat in this family. Patterns of favoritism, of imbalance, of love given with conditions. I've stood in living rooms where one child was showered with gifts, a Mustang, trips to Europe, a Mercedes, while the other child was handed socks, journals, and hollow smiles." Gasps rippled through the room. I opened the file I had carried and placed the papers on the table in front of me. I brought proof, because I know how easily my words can be dismissed. Here are the receipts, the photos, and the bank statements. Here is the truth, laid out in black and white. My parents' faces turned red, their carefully maintained composure cracking. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I pressed on. "This isn't about money. It never was. It's about love. It's about recognition. It's about the way a child grows up knowing they will never be enough, no matter how hard they try. It's about the scars you don't see, the ones left by years of being overlooked." The silence in the ballroom was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Some guests looked at me with sympathy, others with discomfort. But I didn't care about their reactions. For once, I was speaking for myself. I closed the file and straightened my shoulders. I'm not here to ruin a wedding. I'm here to tell the truth. Because for too long, I've let myself shrink in silence. Tonight, I choose not to. With that, I stepped back. I didn't wait for applause or for excuses, or for my parents to sputter defenses. I didn't wait for Michael to roll his eyes, or for Lauren to whisper in his ear. I simply picked up my clutch, nodded to Claire, and walked toward the exit. As we stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of muffled voices rising behind us, Claire slipped her arm through mine. "You did it," she whispered. For the first time in my life, I felt light. Not because the family had changed, not because they finally understood, but because I had chosen myself over their approval. The weight of years of silence had lifted. We laughed as we walked to the car, the kind of laughter that bubbles up from relief, from freedom. The Charleston night sky stretched wide above us, stars glimmering like a promise. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear much from my family. A few terse messages trickled in, filled with defensiveness and denial. But they didn't sting the way they once would have. I had expected them. What mattered was that I had finally drawn a line. My life in Asheville grew richer. The friendships I had built deepened. My home became a gathering place, filled with warmth and laughter that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choice. On quiet mornings, I sat on my porch swing with a cup of coffee, the mountains spread out before me, and I felt a peace I never knew growing up. Family, I learned, wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about the people who showed up, who listened, who loved without condition. Claire, my new friends, the community that welcomed me. They became my family, piece by piece. Looking back, the Rolex, the Mustang, the Mercedes, all of it feels small compared to what I've gained. My worth is no longer tethered to their approval or measured in gifts. It's measured in boundaries I've set, in the friendships I've nurtured, in the quiet joy of knowing I am enough. That, I realized, is wealth greater than any material thing. And so, as I close this chapter of my life, I do so not as the overlooked daughter of a family who never saw me, but as a woman who chose herself, built her own home, and surrounded herself with love that is genuine, lasting, and true.